We were told categorically in March that people would be tested before they went back to care homes. We only subsequently found out that that hadn't happened. Now, all the government rhetoric was we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It was complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
Now, do you accept, before we get into the detail of this, that those are very serious allegations by a man who should have known what was going on, who was in the know at the time?
Well, maybe he should have. The situation with respect to care homes is that we brought in the policy of wanting to test everybody who went into a care home as soon as we had those tests available. And look, everybody had a challenge in care homes around Europe, around this country, in Scotland, in Wales as well. Some of the people most vulnerable to COVID live in care homes, and it was a huge challenge. But at the time, you'll remember, because we talked about it extensively, we didn't have the testing capacity, and I built that testing capacity, put in place the 100,000 target, and we got the tests, and then we could implement the policy.
There's a very, very specific allegation. Did you tell the Prime Minister in March that people were not going from hospitals into care homes without being tested at a time when you knew that wasn't true?
Well, ironically here, I did exactly what is alleged, which is we would bring in testing when the testing capacity was available.
So it's a question of tenses. You didn't tell the Prime Minister that people were going from hospitals into care homes without being tested?
Well, throughout, some were tested where there were tests available. That happened throughout. But there were not enough tests available to test everybody. And the clinical advice at the time was that hospital is a dangerous place for people who might end up getting COVID after they've taken the test, but before the result comes through. And anyway, what matters is that you have the infection prevention control when you're in the care home.
We have talked, you're quite right, we've talked an awful lot about this. I am just looking really for a yes or no answer about this, because it's a very straightforward question. Did you tell Boris Johnson in March that people sent from hospitals into care homes were being tested when you knew they weren't?
No, I did not.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Were you so Dominic Cummings was lying about that?
No, because I think that he, in what he just said, he said that people would be. And the truth is, of course, that was the policy to get people those tests available.
All right.
But I had to build this testing capacity. It didn't exist.
So before it existed, were you sending people from hospitals into care homes knowing that they might have COVID and they weren't being tested?
Well, we know absolutely that the testing wasn't available to test everybody. And if you recall at the time, the advice was, the clinical advice was that very few people would be able to pass on COVID if they didn't have any symptoms. So the testing was reserved for those who had symptoms because there was so little testing available.
You said there wasn't the capacity, but on the 27th of March, by the 27th of March, you had the capacity to do 10,000 tests a day. And we're talking in total here about 25,000 people. So if you'd put that, if that had been your focus, you could have done all this testing within 3 days.
No, because we need tests for all sorts of other things as well. Yeah, we need.
But it's priorities, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's other people's lives we needed to save too. So when there isn't enough testing capacity, of course there's challenges in areas where you'd like to use it, and that's why I set the target. So, and if you remember,
was the capacity there? It's a question of where your priority was. 10,000 a day you were doing by then. No, we're talking about 25,000 people in total.
So. Just a couple of things on that. The first is the specific accusation which you played was from the start of March, when there wasn't 10,000. There was more like just over 2,000 tests. And it was only because I was driving this testing expansion so much that we ended up with the bigger capacity. But secondly, to say you could test all these people if you did no other tests for 3 days, well, there are other uses for the tests that are just as, if not more, life-saving. What we needed to solve this problem was more tests. And what I did was put in place the target for 100,000 tests, and we hit that target. And others may not have worked towards it, but I drove the whole system, and the whole system responded with this extraordinary expansion of testing capacity, which allowed us to do these critical things.
This is a very solemn issue because we remember how many people died in care homes in the following period. Now, whatever you think of Dominic Cummings, and there's clearly some kind of history between the two of you, he did make a clear personal apology in the House of Commons for his role in that. He said there was a mistake and he was very, very sorry about it, and he apologised to the families involved. Would you do the same?
Well, what I'd say is that at the time, we followed the best clinical advice. And even now, but I know, because I lost a member of my family in the second peak who lived in a care home, okay? So I understand this. I know where people are coming from. I know what it feels like. But what I'd say is that at that time, everybody was working as hard as possible to protect as many lives as possible on the evidence we had at the time. And in fact, this is true across different administrations, across this country, across the whole of Europe. And
so you don't regret those decisions?
Well, what I know that those decisions were all taken on the best evidence with the best intentions, even though there were huge challenges that we were facing.